Welcome, everybody. We are live ahead of qualifying for the Hungarian Grand Prix. And for the first time in a few weeks, the whole gang is here. Rob's back in the other seat. We've got Terry coming to us live from the London E-Prix. He'll be here in a few minutes. And Rob, we have a lot to unpack from these free practice sessions.
Yeah, Adam, great to be back. Really looking forward to this show. And there's so much flying around as there is every week. I think the big difference between this season and last season is that every weekend there just seems to be another pivotal decision to make. Whereas last year, it just felt like we were on autopilot for half of the year. So looking forward to unpacking everything in the next 60 minutes.
Yeah, we're putting in more work than we ever did last year. That's for certain. And
Definitely.
these last few weeks, we've been talking about the three constructors and which of the three should we pull in. But now a fourth constructor has entered the mix with Ferrari's resurgence through these free practice sessions. The early rider sims have them very prominent in some of the suggestions that they give all of us. So this is going to be a big hour as we try to sort through our teams and our viewers' teams on how do we make the most of all of them.
Yeah, definitely. So lots of interesting lineups that have come through on our fan app base. If you haven't already submitted one, be sure to do so. We'll go through it live on stream, and very much looking forward to seeing what decisions you guys are grappling with this year, or this week, should I say?
Feels like every week is its own season unto itself, for sure.
Definitely.
And also, while you're in our fan app base, feel free to enter our contest. The question for the Fifth Gear Garms giveaway this week is, which driver group scores more fantasy points in Hungary? Is it Team UK with Lando, George, and Lewis, or Team Rest of World with Verstappen, Piastri, and Carlos Sainz? So if you missed our preview show, we went head-to-head with Alex Brundle, who picked the Brits. Rob and I picked Rest of the World. And this is going to be very interesting because our last few race winners are in the Brits group, but the Rest of World group is looking pretty good.
Yeah, I really like the look of Oscar in FP3. It's probably a good time to bring up the timing chart shortly, but you look at the likes of Max, who, as I think we've talked about a little bit this week already, brought upgrades to Hungary, and then Oscar, or McLaren in particular, just look very strong, even though I think they're dealing with a few different cooling, overheating issues, which Terry can cover off when we get him on in a minute. And then who's the third driver? Is that Charles?
From FP3?
Of the non-Brits.
Oh, the non-Brits is Carlos.
Carlos, yeah. So he was looking excellent as well through practice. So I think the Brits and the non-Brits for our contest question are pretty evenly matched.
I can't wait to see it. Yeah, let's bring up those FP3 results and we can get into a little bit about what we saw. This was a very interesting session because I was trying to stare at the Red Bull team the whole time because you have that radically upgraded car for Verstappen, Perez running the old livery, but they went with a very different approach for us. They spent most of the session on hards, working on those long runs. They slapped on the softs, each did a single run, which Jolien said on the broadcast, it's hard to nail all of your spots going from a slow race pace to a fast qualifying pace run. So they were a little bit lower on the timing sheets. They boxed Perez and we never saw them again. Verstappen tried to do one last flyer with time running out, but had a huge lockup into turn one, and that killed his lap. So Red Bull a bit lower on the timing table than we would have expected, but also a weird run plan for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel as though FP1's never really the practice session everyone reads into all that much, because in some cases you've got reserve drivers running, you're testing different components on the car. So I don't really think until we see like the latter stages of FP2 and certainly FP3, which I think becomes a huge factor in our decisions, that we actually start to see some momentum behind some of these choices. Let's go into FP2, where Lando came out on top. McLaren were kind of languishing in the bottom half of the top 10 in FP1. Max and Carlos staying kind of around the top 3, top 4. And then I think the biggest mover and biggest improvement for me compared to late was Sergio Perez. Now, I want to get your take on the Red Bull Constructor and kind of what his form means for a good result at Hungary. He did have a great drive here last year. I believe he finished P3 after a pretty terrifying qualifying. So do you think Red Bull have got what it takes? Because there doesn't seem to be all that many people on the Red Bull Constructor. So I think that if it pays off, could send you high up the ranks.
So I'm rosier on Red Bull than many others, Rob. And I have some optimism in Perez, even though he's not in that upgraded Red Bull this weekend. Mm-hmm. For one, when we look at the long runs from FP2, he actually had the fastest long runs of anyone on the grid, including both McLaren's and his teammate. He has a history of managing his tires well in these kinds of conditions, and the Red Bull tends to come alive a bit more in warmer conditions. So I think his baseline is a bit higher than we've seen in some of these cooler tracks. As you mentioned, last year, this was a get-right race for Perez. He had a streak of some pretty tough results, came into Hungary, put it on the podium. It was Red Bull's first double podium in several weeks. And so I think this is a track that maybe he thrives at a bit more than usual. And then also for Red Bull as a constructor, there are a few things that give me reason to believe that the fastest pit stops will be in play for them, as they usually are. The first is that this is a 2 pit stop race. So the more throws at the dartboard you have, the more likely it is that they're going to hit that fastest pit stop. And then Ruth Buscombe had a really interesting piece of analysis on the grid box locations. So Max in P1 from the championship last year, his grid box is flat on. Everybody else is coming in at an angle. So I wonder if the fine margins of starting and stopping your pit stop time give that advantage to Verstappen, because he doesn't have to angle in and angle out.
Yeah, I did think about that. I think for me, if I'm changing up my constructors at this point of the season, it has to be a long-term hold. And I think I'd want to see a couple more sustained performances from Red Bull for me to get them back in. But I have talked about them a little bit already this week too. And I do think that they do make, if Perez can just get inside the top 5, a super compelling case to re-enter the conversation.
Absolutely. And there are so many different considerations with these constructors. I think McLaren is the only one that stands out as a lock to have 2 drivers in and around the top 5. You saw Lando and Oscar P1 and P2 and FP3. Lando, you see here at the top of FP2. So they clearly have that form. Mercedes, they've won the last 2 races, but now I worry about my boys in warmer conditions. They were saying that the track could be up to 20 degrees warmer tomorrow than it is today, which makes me worry that they'll qualify high and then drop down. They got pole at this circuit the last 2 years, and they didn't secure the race win in either of them, again, because I worry about some of the effects of hotter track temperatures.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mercedes, sure. And again, I'm curious to get Terry's take on this later as well, but I think every team's going to be impacted by the heat regardless. And sure, maybe some teams more than others, but I think it'll get to a point where the difference is almost negligible depending on how hot it really does get. So I think other than McLaren, which you pointed out, Mercedes, honestly, to me, probably seem the next most competitive team in terms of just consistency and reliability. Perez, he's got probably the highest likelihood of all drivers in the top 4 teams of going out before Q3. And as a result of that, the teammate points on offer in qualifying are probably at risk there. But then again, the pit stops maybe offset that a little bit. And then Ferrari, I just don't know what to expect from them this weekend, because they look great at stages throughout yesterday and this morning. But I just haven't seen any compelling argument for me to be like wowed by them so far. So I'm just content with rolling back my constructors for the next week and seeing, even if they're not the top 2 scoring ones, I'm sure they'll still be close to.
Yeah, and that covers off Jack in the chat. He said, I was all set to change Ferrari to Mercedes, and now I'm back to doubting it. And that's because you had some good early sessions from both Ferraris. I found it funny that they call this track Monaco without walls, yet Charles Leclerc did find a wall, and that was a pretty big shunt in FP2. And then I think this is a very pivotal decision for those teams that are a bit behind in the standings and trying to make a shakeup. If you can invest in a team on the rise, you're going to get the points and the cost cap game way ahead of strategists like you and I, Rob, that are a bit more conservative, want to see them prove it first. I need to see them prove it before I start getting back into Ferrari. But for some of you that need that cost cap, that need to jump ahead a little bit, this is a differential play that could get you a little help. And the previous sims from F1 Fantasy Tools tend to agree with heavy indexing on Carlos and the Ferrari constructor.
Which makes for an excellent segue into the sims, because thanks to Mike and Ali for shouting that out. We were expecting FP3 sims to come through, and it looks like, I think, let's start with the drivers. The most interesting thing for me is now Piastri is higher than Max for this weekend, and I think a lot of people were debating whether or not to bring him in over a Russell or a Hamilton. I think the proof is in the pudding. I think Oscar has that big race. If there was ever a time, I feel like this could be that weekend. So I'm expecting good things for Oscar this week. And I think Norris, we may have talked about previously as well, ahead of Max now in the points projection. So a huge boon for McLaren if they can capitalize on good form at the moment.
When Ryder first posted the Sims for the weekend, it showed Norris so high above. He said that it's basically heavily projecting driver of the day for Lando. So even a race win for Max, but driver of the day and a couple overtakes for Lando, and that will shoot him right above. So makes plenty of sense that he's up there. I think he's one of the few locks entering the week for you and I, Rob.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. It's a no-brainer. And I from the start of the season just wanted a driver that I could leave in the 2X spot in Lando and let it kind of roll for a few weeks. So I'm just glad McLaren have got that consistency under their belt at the moment. So I mean, one more thing on the Sims, which now Ferrari appear to have dropped down below Mercedes and McLaren really have surged, is that the other simulations we look at, which we'll get to in a minute, are the race pace and qualifying pace simulations that F1 put out after FP2. I feel as though they're much less certain. At least the last few races, I've not been as big a believer of these and been much more reliant on the F1 Fantasy Tools points projections, which I feel like are gospel more often than not. So I've kind of been backed up for my decision this week for my team. But when we go to the race and quali sims later, it probably will be a bit of a mixed bag compared to what we're seeing on screen here.
I wondered that when I first saw F1.com's race sims, I wondered if the long red flag from Leclerc and FP2 threw off the times of teams' long runs. And so they were sampling from FP1 for the long pace. So you had potentially different car setups to compare your race and quali sim. So that's why you might have Alpine and Aston Martin radically on opposite ends of the table between the two sims. So I'm also inclined to discount them this week too.
Definitely. I know we've got probably like 10 to 15 minutes till we get Terry in. Let's cover off a few quick questions in the chat, and then we maybe could get to a couple of lineups as well.
Let's do it. All right. So let's see. Marco wants to know the big question: Ferrari or Mercedes? For us, it looks like we'd both lean toward Mercedes, given that choice. Rob, you do have that choice, and you've picked Mercedes. I think for us, it comes down to seeing it. Once Ferrari have given us a sense that they're back, they're running the same car, and it can handle high speed and low speed corners, we'd probably invest in a little bit more. But until we really see that the dysfunction that has held them back in these last few races is behind them,
definitely,
I tend to stick with Mercedes.
That's fair. I'm inclined to as well for the time being. Leaps Frogs in the chat who you spoke to during the week. So hello, Andrew. I think that's a question for Terry in terms of track temperature between yesterday and today. And I imagine, as you pointed out, that could affect the race and qualifying performances of certain cars. But I'm curious to pick Terry's brain on track temperature. Nuff 1R, -10 to drop Gasly or just keep him. Are we looking at another DNF? Dropping Gasly would mean I keep Zhou, which I don't want to do. I don't think we're looking at another DNF for Gasly because we weren't even expecting one in Silverstone. I don't think unless we've got information before the deadline that we just expect DNFs. And
when you look at the sims too, you can see that basically Tsunoda, double Haas, double Alpine are within 1 point of each other in the sim. So it's really just a matter of which one of them you think will do better in this circuit. I think I'm going with Tsunoda this week, given this choice. And he's looked the better of the 4 or 5 drivers over the last few sessions, but it could be anybody's race.
I honestly think, even though it's probably not reflected on the sims here on F1 Fantasy Tools, Albon for me looked very good in practice. So I think he's probably my pick of, aside from maybe Hülkenberg and Tsunoda, probably my third favorite C tier driver. But I think the -10, you can tell, and I think you and I have both been big believers of not going for -10s for C tier drivers. But the difference in points between Tsunoda and the lowest driver in Bottas is just over 5.5 points. So that 10 points is probably not going to pay itself off. Certainly not at a track where there are so few overtakes. So I would just avoid -10s when swapping C tiers for C tiers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yash asked a similar question: Tsunoda versus Magnussen versus Gasly. It's a fair question because we were all in on Gasly given the penalty last week. Magnussen leads the grid in value gained on the season. He's top 5 in overtakes on the season. But I think this is a track where it's sort of anybody's race, as Rob said. Fewer overtakes. You're going to have a lot of cluster in the middle. So I would just go with the faster car, which to me right now is Sonoda.
Definitely agree. Hawkins has said, I've maxed DRS, Albon, Hulkenberg, Sonoda, Mercedes, McLaren to make. I am 0.2 away from a Lando and George build. I mean, the team looks good. I'm not sure if he's saying he can't afford that, but I still think, if you can't get to a Lando and a George or an Oscar and a George, if you can, bolster your team with more reliable C tiers. So move out Sargents, move out Bottas's and Zhou's, and maybe upgrade to Gasly's or Magnussen's, for instance.
Yeah, agreed. It looks like you're right at the precipice of the next big lineup for you. So I would lean a little bit more into these cost cap gainers, maybe sacrifice a few points here and there. And that's the beauty of these sims from F1 Fantasy Tools as well. You can sort of mix and match until you have the best upside for that cost cap growth.
Definitely. Russell and Oscar or Norris and C tier. I feel like it's a tough one, but I've already gone for Norris and Russell, so it's a bit of a weird one for me. But I would probably go for, if you're prioritizing points this weekend, probably Russell and Oscar, just because there's going to be very little opportunities for C tier drivers to make passes.
I agree. And when you see my team later, you'll see Norris and a C tier driver, but it's partly because I want the flexibility looking ahead to Spa. If Max takes that engine penalty, as he's done 2 of the last 3 years, he's set season highs in fantasy scoring when he's done that. And so I want to have enough flexibility where I don't want to totally undo my team. So while I think Russell and Oscar will score a bit more, I'm just holding station with Norris in the C tier.
Nice. Let's get a couple lineups. What do you reckon, Adam, before we get Terry on in a little bit?
Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. We'll get back to all the questions in the chat. We promise. We've been trying to prioritize answering as many as possible so you guys don't have those go unanswered. Can you see this? Can you see this all right, Adam?
So I have it up on my own screen just in case, because I always struggle to see it when it's shared. But this is from our friend Mike, and Mike is in between a triple McLaren and just basically Lando and great tier C drivers.
I mean, my team's already gone in the direction of the team on the right-hand side because of the talk around less overtakes and less points. And I do think I was looking at the points changes last year at Hungary, and I think this is quite a telling statistic that if we're looking at the A and B tier drivers this year, the only non-AB drivers that got a price increase was Stroll's in the B tier now, but it was Stroll and Albon, and every other price increase was an A and a B tier asset. So no other drivers below 15 million got an increase at Hungary. So that's why I'm thinking if you can just get more kind of top heavy drivers in your team this week, the chances of price gain and points probably will naturally flow. So that's why I'm leaning towards the team on the right for Mike.
That's a great point. And I'm glad you answered that, Rob, because basically the team on the left was similar to what you came into the week with Lando in the 4-strong tier C. So you heard it straight from somebody with that same decision.
I think we may have seen this already from Jeremy, but this looks a lot similar to Mike's, almost identical, I think. So I think the team on the right for me is...
I think the one difference with Jeremy now is Mike is keeping... Yeah, Mike's got Mercedes all the way across, and this is moving out Red Bull to a Ford Piastri.
Yeah, no, I think I still like the right-hand side. And you're not having to run Sauber and Sargent. Most people do or can't afford that budget. So I like the right-hand side. Even the role transfer maybe isn't compelling enough for me this week.
Yeah, it's the beauty of building budget. Looks like Jeremy's right up against it to make that lineup. So it's a good use of that extra few bucks is see if you can have this differential that others can't afford.
Yeah, definitely. Gezelik.
All right. Yeah, we'll do this one more before we welcome in Terry.
Yeah.
And again, very similar. The ends are basically Jeremy's lineup. Lando McLaren Red Bull versus triple McLaren Mercedes. And then the middle looks like slightly only difference is Ricciardo versus Sonoda. So again, I think
you've probably got Red Bull, right? So I'm always happy to give you the floor if you want to try and make the case for one of the left two lineups.
I'll tell you. So I lean more toward Red Bull. So I'm going to be a defender more than I think a lot of you are. Mercedes has been so popular over the last few weeks. With Red Bull, I think Perez could sneak into the top 10 in qualifying, get you the extra 5 teammate points. He hangs around the top 10 for the whole race and Max wins. Then the fastest pit stop points are a differentiator. But again, when you look at the most recent sims, they're all those constructors are all within 3 points of each other: Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull, with only McLaren standing out.
Yep. Okay, let's do BZ, and then we'll get the great man Terry, and
fantastic
wild card. Interesting.
Oh, and BZ's got this is a fun team. So it looks like trying to take advantage of as much cost cap as possible. You've got the 2 tier B constructors, be an early investor in Ferrari with the hopes that they turn it around this week with otherwise strong assets around the rest of the team.
I really like it as certainly the differential constructor lineup, because I think Ferrari, if they can get their act together, are going to soar, but it is a little bit of an if for me. And as you pointed out before, we are probably more on the conservative side. So I think if they get their act together, I think Ferrari could be good, but it's a wait and see for me for now. As
we mentioned earlier, I think you have enough leftover cash, BZ, maybe upgrading Gasly to Yuki this week, but then otherwise this is a green light.
Yeah.
All right. So now joining us live from the London EP is the man himself, Terry from F1 Coffee Corner. You saw in the chat earlier, we've posted the latest Tech Corner article where we're going to break down some of the biggest technical upgrades heading into this weekend. Terry, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yourself?
Oh, doing well, thanks. It's so nice to have you on.
Oh, no, apologies if you get a bit of background noise. I'm in the hotel lobby, so.
It's well worth it. It's well worth it. Terry, I want to start diving into these big upgrades of the weekend, starting with that Red Bull upgrade, because I'm trying to hope that my fantasy team will get some extra boost from the Red Bull constructor. What do you see as the difference between Max and Checo? And in a non-upgraded Red Bull, can Checo do enough to survive this race?
It's really interesting to see the difference between the two, especially that engine cooling in that back area. It is quite a substantial change on Max's car. It does look more traditional, so I'd say in the sense it looks more like the RB18, RB19 did before. You know, it's those big vents have kind of gone from the shoulder pads and that sort of thing. So in the heat, is that going to be a concern? Because obviously we're expecting hotter temperatures you've been talking about earlier in the show. Is that going to be a problem for Max's car that they don't know about potentially because the cooling has changed? Like with anything, you start changing with engine cooling, you start messing with those sort of settings without any on-track testing of that. You don't know what that's going to do to the cars. With regards to sort of Checo and his form, he looked good in FP2, but then kind of dropped off again in FP3. But there is something around the tyres with Red Bull. They were saving some tyres because of what they did yesterday. So I'm not surprised with that. Only the slight run on the hard tyres. It's a 2-stop strategy here. Medium and hards, you're probably not going to see the softs, especially with the temperatures being predicted at all tomorrow, unless it's a quick sort of flying lap setting on that one. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what they do. Max looks comfortable, or a lot more comfortable now. They have tweaked a lot of stuff. And he's always going to be in contention, isn't he? Despite, even if the car maybe not up to performance. So I think they need to get Checo back scoring points from a constructor's point of view, though. And he needs some big performances both here and in Spa next week for probably his sake more than anything else.
Exactly. I need Checo to perform, but he needs Checo to perform even more.
Absolutely. I think Red Bull need Checo to perform, let's be honest.
I mean, Adam talked about this being a turning point for Checo last season, Terry, and I think there were a couple of encouraging signs from him yesterday and this morning in practice. Do you think this is a track where he can turn in a P4 top 5 type of performance, or is that still something that might be a bit beyond his reach? Because I know these upgrades seem to be more conducive to what he's getting out of the car lately. Is it something that we can actually see happening, or is it maybe a bit beyond what's possible?
I think it depends on his qualifying, which hasn't been his strong point. It's not, if you think back to last year and potentially the year before, we had this sort of triple DRS effect with Red Bull. So yeah, they had a lot of opportunity to overtake going into that turn 1, turn 2 here with those 2 DRS zones, how they got it. So I think if Checo has a strong qualifying, it will be a lot more of an easier sort of task for him. I think if he's coming back through the pack, the RB20 hasn't got that pace advantage that the RB19 certainly enjoyed from last year. So I think he's going to find it a lot more difficult on a track that's traditionally quite hard to overtake. Sort of anywhere else apart from these first couple of corners. Let's be honest, it's quite a high downforce, slow medium corners everywhere else. One detection zone going at that start finish rate. So if he's qualifying low and has to come back through, he's going to find it extremely difficult, I think.
Well, it's interesting you say that, and I do think it very much hinges on his qualifying performance as well. But if looking at last year's results in Hungary, Perez made up six places in the race, which was the second best compared to all other drivers in the field. And maybe that's just a case of the car last season being so much better than it is currently. But I do think if it's to be believed, the car is turnaround in form at this track, we could see something special from him. So who knows?
I think he needs it. His back's against the wall, and I wouldn't rule Checo out in that situation. And I certainly wouldn't rule anything out with Red Bull and strategy. We know that Hannah's paid absolute masterminds. Did again in Silverstone with the calls for Max as well. So, if anything, we know they're going to be on point with their strategy, which could just bring him into play as well.
And I think the success of Red Bull as a viable constructor in F1 fantasy depends on the relative success of Mercedes, who've won these last two races. But now we're starting to wonder, will the heat impact them? And the quote from Lewis after FP2 was, quote, "The car just felt as bad as it normally does when it's hot." And so he was 7th in FP1, 10th in FP2, starting to come back in FP3, but it's a cooler day today. How do you think Mercedes will fare in a much hotter temperature tomorrow?
To be honest, Mercedes doesn't like the hot temperature. I mean, we discussed it before we come on air. If you think back to Bahrain, qualified high, poor race, very similar sort of circumstances with the difference in temperature is what we're expecting. So I think, if it is as hot as what people are predicting, that could put Mercedes out of play. George looks much more comfortable with the car. They've had a minor update that they brought for this weekend. It was literally nothing. It was sort of steering off a bit on the back. So it wasn't anything substantial in that sense. They have made setup changes. They actually broke curfew last night to make some changes. So they have been working on it. So I just think that George looks happier, but I'm not sure, again, Mercedes will need that high qualifying, which they've got the potential to do. They've done well around here in the past. And then if they qualify high, can they hold on to it for the race itself? Or will they have to turn down the engines, cope with the cooling, that side of things? I think that's a big concern for Mercedes. Will they have to manage something on those cars tomorrow? George had water pump problems in Silverstone. All these little things, are they going to play a factor in the race itself?
Well, that was, I guess, a question I was posing to Adam, and you've probably already answered it somewhat already. But in terms of the heat and how that can implicate all of the teams, sure, I suppose it sounds like Mercedes will be the ones that suffer a little more than the rest of the field. But would it, if it got to a certain point in temperature, and I think Leapsfrog asked this question as well, like how is it going to affect everyone else? Like, surely you'd think all the cars are subject to the heat in some capacity, right? And the performance that would obviously follow as a result.
Yeah, I mean, they are. I mean, you got to think normally it's sort of 10, 12 degrees higher sort of track temperature than what the ambient temperature is. The hotter the track is, the less optimum performance you got from the tyres. The tyres are heated, so obviously they wear out quicker, so you got tyre wear. So the way it will affect the teams is which cars are better on their tyres, for example. So we know that McLaren seems to be actually quite good with their tyre wear, or certainly Lando does. I know some that Oscar's actually struggled with, but Lando seems to be able to manage those tyres through those phases a lot better and then come back a lot more. So that's probably where you're going to see it more in terms of how it impacts the team. So yes, it impacts all of them. But if you've got a team which is particularly harsh on their tyres, they're going to burn out a lot quicker, which then, compromises your strategy because you have to make an earlier stop or you have to do something out of the ordinary because you're losing too much time. The engines, they should be okay. They should know what the temperature is. So unless there's a major swing in the race in terms of track temperature, but there will be a setup option they have to go for today, where, do they do a setup with the option of the weather tomorrow in mind, or do they go for, the one that pace to get a good qualifying position? We know that, Adam touched on it earlier about, there are extreme weather conditions where you can make changes to the car if the FIA deem it as that. it's risky because they need to be very much a big swing before the FIA will let you make those changes outside of part firming. So if you're going to make that call, it is risky. You've got to, I think you set up today has got to be with qualifying in mind, with the race in mind tomorrow.
And to that end, Terry, Sam Collins really stirred the pot at the end of FP3. He broke down the McLaren and the Haas cooling system at the back of the car. It was very narrow, as if to assume that they were working for today and not for tomorrow. And so if the race control doesn't allow them to change their cooling approach because the track temperatures are significantly changing, and they stick with that configuration for qualifying, I imagine it could cause them both some harm tomorrow. And like Rob said, the heat would then start impacting the grid more evenly.
Yeah, that's where you're going to get you qualify high because you've got the optimum setup. But then in the race itself, you might have to make those differences, those changes, because you're managing. You know, if you're following a car, your car tends to overheat a lot more, tends to be a lot warmer if you're in traffic. So again, that's going to make a difference. Here, I think because of the layout of the track, you're going to be following quite a lot. It's not a track where you'll see a car get a massive advantage because there's only that one long straight. The rest is that twisty sort of complex. So you're going to be in traffic quite a lot going around it. So that's going to play a problem with the engines. Some of the engines, they come to the end of their life. So we know that some of the teams are, rolling the dice with engine penalties. We know, Max is one in terms of got one due to be taken. So are the engines in the car not up to optimum because they're 5-6 races in? That kind of thing plays a part as well with reliability.
That's a great point because Jolien brought this up earlier, mentioning the age of Max Verstappen's power unit, but then how new Perez's was because they took that penalty because they were so bad at Silverstone that he's got a fresh power unit. Does that enable him to push a little bit more in ways that some of the drivers in the top of the field reaching the end of their allocation may not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they'll probably start off quite similar, but as the race progresses, if you've got an opportunity to turn up, going back to Rob's point about, if you've got someone coming back through like Perez, if he's got a new engine, then there's much more scope in it to turn that up, rather than if you've got one like Max's, which is old, naturally it's got wear and tear on it, it's got all its kilometers on it. So, that could then lead to a managing problem or could just lead to a lower setting because you're managing it.
Interesting. There was actually reports on a bit of rain at Hungary, drizzle. A couple of folks in the chat, George's, You Eat Soap, and someone else mentioned rain. I wonder if that's going to implicate qualifying at all.
I think it was dew showers. It's
just
quite
drizzle.
thunderstormy. Yeah, I think it's quite thunderstormy. So if anything, it might just be a shower that blows over. I don't think there's anything major forecast. Unless we get the rain that we saw on, Wednesday or Thursday in Hungary, where it flooded the pit lane.
Yeah, it should be an interesting qualifying session. I think there'll be quite a few surprises. Terry, do you want to give us a rundown on your team this week?
Yes. I decided to go with Mercedes and not Ferrari, mainly because of Charles's performance. I'm still very dubious on that. I think Carlos is performing well, but I do think that Charles still worries me in terms of that turn 12 a couple of times has been caught out there and how much. I don't think Ferrari know the optimum setup for their car. I mean, they brought flaws that they sent straight back to Maranello this week. They clearly don't know what is their best performance. So it kind of feels they're going for a bit of potluck, I'm afraid to say. So I've kept Max, probably from a point of view, he's not going to get driver of the day, but I think he'll get the win. I've got Nico Hulkenberg. I've actually gone with the Visa cash-up drivers. I've gone with Yuki and Daniel and swapped Pierre out because I think they've looked comfortable. Daniel's looked comfortable for the past couple of days. Yuki looks a lot more comfortable in free practice 3, to be honest. It's a track that seems to suit them in what they've got above Sauber. I mean, Sauber have got some massive updates, pretty much a new car on certainly Valtteri's. We've been trying to clarify if it's on Joe's as well. Valtteri's definitely got it, but ironically, Joe's been performing better, so maybe you should try that setter. And then dovetailed with obviously Logan because of the cost cap implication. So, and then I've got Mercedes and McLaren.
Nice.
It's a great three-way hedge. There are 3 teams at the top of the grid. You got a piece of Max, a piece of McLaren, and a piece of Mercedes. So you're going to get it right one way or the other. And I think that's also very validating of some of our guidance at the top of the call, moving out of Gasly and into one of those RB drivers. You think about since Imola, their average starting position, I think Yuki's 11.1, Ricardo's 11.6, so they're right at the top of the the midfield. And then also over the last 5 races, Ricardo is on, I think, 4 straight races of 0.5 million increases. He's the third highest driver over the last 5 races in terms of cost cap gains. So both RB drivers are really starting to show their worth in the fantasy game.
Yeah, and again, Daniel's another one with a point to prove, isn't he, at the moment in terms of his future. So, a lot of this is playing a part in performances as well. Right before the summer break, I think, there's a couple of drivers out there who are certainly feeling the pressure with the summer break approaching.
Definitely. Do you have any updates on the driver market? We just heard the other day about K-Mag departing Haas. Ocon seems like the favorite for that second seat. Are there any other kind of rumors or news that you can share with us?
So Esteban Ocon should be signing next week for Haas. So probably Wednesday, Thursday. That's looking most likely going into Spa. So before the summer break, that's pretty much, I'd say, almost guaranteed now. Even though there was that late sort of Williams talk about a swap. Williams seem to be favouring Valtteri at the moment. Held quite a few talks. They actually held talks with him again in Silverstone. So they're leaning towards that. I think they've run out of patience with Carlos. Jane Vowles certainly sees it as, I think, almost like a bit of an insult from Carlos that he was about to sign and then backed away, having his head turned by Alpine. And I think there might be a bit of principle coming there where actually he doesn't want to see Williams as a stepping stone for anybody. So I think he might be sort of trying to make out that Williams is bigger than Carlos on that front. Whether or not that might change with the powers that be. Obviously, Carlos is a marquee signing for the lower teams there. There are, of course, the rumours of Checo gathering a lot of pace in the summer with a change there. So not to be ruled out at the moment with clauses in contracts. So that might sort of shake up the market a bit more. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it in terms of driver wins at the moment. Logan looks like he's obviously not going to be retained and keep his seat. Kevin doesn't look like he's going to keep his seat in Formula 1, but wants to go off and do other things. Mick Schumacher's test with Alpine apparently went well. So again, there's a lot of talk about Stakes wanted his testing info. His manager's been in Hungary this week, which is normally a sign of something's being negotiated or talked about, because it's unusual for her to be in the paddock with Mick. So again, that kind of points that there's negotiations, if nothing else, going on. And then obviously Alpine, I think, are hedging for Carlos at the moment, but have the option of, like Mick, they've got Jack as well in there. So they've got quite a few options at the moment, I think. So
cool.
It's a very interesting take on Sainz. If he's burned a bridge with Williams, and it feels like he's already burnt a bridge with Sauber, and Alpine have options, he needs to play really nice with them. Otherwise, he has to hope that Mercedes or Red Bull have a seat open. Otherwise, things could get really dicey for him.
Yeah, I just think with Mercedes, I think if they were going to make that move, they would have made it. I know obviously with Kimi, they don't need to make that move, but he's their junior driver. He's under contract for a while. It'd be fine from that point of view. So, but I think if they were going to sign someone like Carlos, they would have done it by now.
Agreed.
Yeah, agreed.
Terry, any final thoughts on this race weekend before we jump back into the chat and lineup reviews?
No, like I said, it's pretty much, two-stop strategy is pretty much bang on around here. Certainly with the weather playing like it's going to be a dry race from what we can see. It'd be, medium hard sort of strategy, depending on which way around you want to do it, on who's got what tyres left. So yeah, it'd be, I think qualifying is going to be key, I think, around here. Like I say, it's not a hugely high overtaking one because of that double DRS and only that one detection point coming into play. So not really high safety car either. It's only sort of around 34%. So again, it's not a big area for that.
Does the safety car basically depend if someone sends it too hard in turn one, thinking back to Bottas bowling or some of the incidents in the years before?
Pretty much.
That's your only chance?
And I think that's probably where the statistics have come from over the past couple of years. It's probably that sort of statistic that's done it. So yeah, definitely.
Fantastic. Well, Terry, have an absolute blast at the E-Prix. You'll be in the media tent for that weekend, so you should have some great content coming out of that race. Say hi to all our friends that'll be there too.
I will. I'll be keeping one on the Formula One tucked in the corner so they don't throw me out.
Fantastic. Terry, thank you again so much.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Rob, where should we go now? Chat, our lineups?
I think we could
lineups?
probably... Let's do a few rapid fire questions in the chat, because there has been quite a bit of activity there and I don't want to feel like we're neglecting our viewers. Sure. I've lost my mark though. I've gone back to 9:20, I think was maybe around the weather.
Yes.
925.
Let me see if I can catch up to you there.
I'm at 922. Alberto.
I just want to call out the rain alert is from a user called You Eat Soap. So thank you for the
Great
note.
name. Great name. Magnussen, Ricciardo, or Tsunoda. I feel like after Terry's stint, probably one of the RB drivers.
Yeah, I would say not Magnussen, flip a coin on the other two. The Sims say Tsunoda, but marginally. Danny Rick is on a longer streak of gaining cost cap, so it's really just personal preference.
Definitely. Jeffrey's asked Russell or Piastri. I think Piastri, if you can afford him, just based on how good McLaren look.
Yes, in light of they were very close in the recent Sims, but the last one, I think Piastri's pulled ahead just enough that we can recommend him.
Agreed. Hey, Lewis, golf went okay yesterday. A friend of mine from Twitter. So thanks for asking. On Limitless, interesting. I don't think many people are running Limitless, but RSYHE asks, which of Checo, Sainz, and Russell for those last two slots would you go at them?
Sainz and Russell.
Yeah.
I would say, even though Ferrari haven't looked great in the last few races, Sainz is definitely the happier of the two Ferraris. I think his upside is higher than Checo's. And then George, his qualifying position has been fantastic these last 4 or 5 races. So even with a little step back from Mercedes in the hotter conditions, I think a top 5 finish is well within grasp.
Definitely.
So the next question is, to afford Norris and Piastri, I have to choose Sargent. Too risky? No.
I've gone with Sargent this week as well, and I can't even afford Piastri just to get Russell in. So I would definitely think if you can triple up on McLaren, I really like the look of that team. No negative given the forecast. No, I think it's going to be a dry race tomorrow, so I would hold off on using that.
F1 TV said it's not just going to be hot; it's going to be rim of a volcano hot. So
stinking hot.
Hold on to your no negative. So Joel's question, if I'm understanding, so a lot of people shorthand Red Bull as RB, but I'm going to assume that you mean, because you have such a loaded team, that maybe you mean Visa Cash App RB.
What do you
think? For
me,
me, I think this reaches the point where I would sacrifice one of the McLarens to bring in Ferrari or Mercedes.
Yeah.
Because the RB drivers are typically just at or outside the top 10 in qualifying. You'll lose all those teammate points. They're never in the mix on pit stops. And then without a lot of ability to move up the grid, I would take those safer assets in the Constructor.
I think Joel may have, if I'm interpreting his question correctly, used his 2 transfers already. Oh. So that would mean that would probably mean a minus 20. Minus 20, right? So I'm not sure if maybe just stick it out for 1 week, hope RB have a good race, and then maybe revert back into a Mercedes McLaren Constructor build.
I care, but not enough to recommend a minus 20 to make that happen.
At that point, that's a wild card, right? Worth going to Norris and Russell with a minus 10. Mercedes Ferrari with those 3, or Mercedes Ferrari with those 3. Hang on, with Russell. So I'm a bit confused by this one, but
yeah, I think ZZ, if you can give us a full picture of your full team before and after, because I think the first part of your question is driver related. The second part is mix and match with the constructors, but I don't think I know where your minus 10 option, what your constructor pairing is.
Yeah. Okay, how are we for time? 9:43. I'd also like to get both of our teams on the screen at some point.
Let's do it. I've locked mine in, and I know you locked yours in to start the hour. I'm happy to cover those off.
Mine is on the other screen.
Ray says only changes.
I always search. There we go.
Ta-da.
I forget you've renamed your team.
So I've done almost a full run back of my team from the last 2 races, subbing out Gasly for Tsunoda per Terry's recommendation. For me, basically, I'm banking on Max winning this race and Perez qualifying and finishing at the bottom of the top 10. If we can get there and Mercedes take that step back, because so many of you are running Mercedes, I think it's a differential play that will move me up. I appreciate that I only got more points than those teams last week because of the Russell DNF, and you can't bank on that every week. So I have to hope that either lightning strikes twice or that Red Bull earn that spot to have more than Mercedes.
Definitely. I mean, if it wasn't for the team I went this week, that was almost the identical lineup I was going to go for, sans Red Bull over Mercedes. So
And
I
something that
think,
was one of the things that was very validating for me is if
mm,
on the fantasy tools sims, if you just crossed out Sargent and said, give me lineups without Sargent, it gives you this right at the top. So,
yeah,
or otherwise some very loony ones with Signs as a 2x driver and Russell or something that would make me really
definitely.
uneasy.
Yeah. No, I like it, Adam. I think Perez can turn it around, like you mentioned this time last year. I think it's definitely you're in for a good weekend. And then throw in the fact that Red Bull Max could take a grid penalty next weekend. You'd probably end up holding Red Bull for that week too.
That's right. Yeah, I'd be looking to see some good points out of that. Rob, tell us about your team.
Yeah, so I went for somewhat similar of a lineup. I moved out Kevin Magnussen and Pierre Gasly in for George Russell and Logan Sargent. Had 6 million sitting on the side, so I wanted to use that, soak that up as much as possible. I just think the rationale for this decision was primarily because there are so few overtakes at Hungary. I looked at the data this time last year at Hungary, and I think I said before, the only drivers that went up in price based on the current A and B drivers this time last year, or non-AB drivers this year, was at Alex Albon. So that was the only C tier increase of current C tier drivers, and makes me think it probably could be a similar theme this time around. We might see a Ricciardo or a Hulkenberg potentially go up in price because they've got a very good car, but realistically wanted to try and chase the upside of Russell, Norris. If I could afford Oscar Piastri instead of Russell, I would, but I just didn't have the ability to do that in 2 trades. So I went for Russell, and I think I really like the team. Even though you've got Sargent and Zhou, I've kind of just bit the bullet and accepted that. They'll probably go down in price, but I do think the points upside for Lando and George is not to be ignored. So that was...
Yeah, agreed. There's enormous upside to this team. You have the hottest constructor in Mercedes, most points over the last 5 races. McLaren is the highest projected constructor and arguably the fastest car on the grid. And then 2 locks for top 5, top 6 finishes in Norris and Russell, no matter what happens. So then really, as long as you have survival from the other 3, which I think in a track like this, you're going to get, it's going to be a big points upside. And I think even a good cost cap upside for you with those Mercedes assets.
Yeah, well, I looked at the fantasy tools projections for this team and a team similar to yours, and it honestly I think was 0.1 million difference in cost cap gain, and it was only 0.1 million more for the 4 C tiers and Lando, which I was like, maybe if it was 1 million or 500,000 more, I'd think about it, but 0.1 just wasn't compelling enough, and the points projections I think were 10 to 15 points more, so I was like, well, it's a no-brainer for me.
That's great.
Awesome. Okay, well, we got 13 minutes. The chat is flying today, and we've got a few more lineups to get through as well.
Yes.
And the contest question. Maybe we do the lineups quickly because there are a few more, then jump back into the chat and then knock out the contest at the end. How do you reckon?
That sounds
reckon?
Let's do it.
Of course.
All right. So Carlos here has Red Bull McLaren versus Mercedes McLaren. Those Mercedes McLaren teams enable some better drivers. I'll tell you right now, option 3 with Fernando, throw it out. And if you look at the bottom of the sims, the 2 Aston Martin drivers are dead last after the Williams and Saubers. So they're predicting a pretty clear drop off. They've seemed unhappy with their upgrades all weekend. And I think there's just a slowness there that I worry about. And they're not able to gain positions in the race. So count me out on option 3. And then option 2, it's really just a matter of, do you prefer a team that's a little bit lighter than Rob's? I think you have a second Sauber instead of Hulkenberg.
Yeah. So it's essentially my team in the middle, and then somewhat of my team in the middle, and then somewhat of your team on the left. So I think Adam would like the left team, and I probably prefer the middle team.
We're both in different camps, but the difference in the sims is like 10 points. Like Rob said, the difference in cost cap is 0.1. So no wrong decisions there.
Elise, love the team. I can't.
Very on brand for you, Elise. Let's get as much Ferrari in there as possible.
Love that.
Because we know you, we're gonna let this one slide. You gotta have Ferrari in.
No, I'm a big fan. McLaren, Mercedes, let's go. Bobby is racing. I think. I mean, we've talked about all of these lineups already, so.
Yeah, it's based my team on the right versus the 2 flavors of yours on the left. I would say, obviously, I like my team, which is the last one, and then Piastri over Russell because I have a little more faith in McLaren than Mercedes.
Agreed. I don't think Alpine's going to be that much stronger this week compared to last week. So I think the middle team for me and the right team for Adam.
Right. Just a couple of drinks.
I think we've done this one already. That was actually, I think, pretty similar to the slide before. So
I'm good
I
with
think it
that
looks
one.
good. Looks good to me. Yeah. And then Archun has submitted 3 teams, which again, pretty similar, I would say.
Yes.
Although this one looks to be slightly lighter than I think what you're currently running on the right-hand side, Adam.
Yeah, so it looks like this person might have a little less cost cap than you and I because the options are similar but a little less.
I think at that point, I like the middle team. If you can somehow bolster, I mean, you probably could bolster these two with 2.5, but I wonder if the trades have already been used that you can't. So I've got no problems with that middle lineup.
Yeah, if you have any trades left, Bottas to an RB driver, I think you can swing it for 2.8. Gets you right to 10.5, which is where I think Yuki is.
Yeah.
So I would try that with option 2.
Cool. All right, that does the lineups, Adam. I'm gonna throw up the fantasy tools data on the screen, so if people need to look at drivers, they can decide.
Yeah, see if we can rapid fire some questions in the chat, and then in about 2 minutes we'll have to get to the contest.
Agreed.
If you haven't answered the contest questions on the bottom of our screen, who's going to score more points, the Brits or the rest of the world? Good. Let's see. I'm at timestamp 9:39. Hopefully that's close.
Yeah.
Shashank asks, take Albon and Bottas out for Tsunoda and Sargent.
I'd probably go the out. Oh, it's tough. Probably, I don't know. What do you think? I feel like Sargent is just a more affordable Sauber driver right now, and the RB Terry was saying looks very good. So maybe Tsunoda Sargent.
They're right. So if you look at the fantasy tools, they're all within a point with Sargent and Zhou slightly higher. So maybe that Sargent Tsunoda, it would be better because Albon and Bottas are right to the bottom.
Yeah, nice. I like it.
All right. Kalula 311 says Russell Hulkenberg versus Piastri, Bottas / Albon. Ooh, that's close. I like Piastri better than Russell, but I like Hulkenberg a lot more than the other two.
I did too.
It's close, but give me the first one. The first half, Russell Hulkenberg.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to actually, it's probably fine. It's honestly even when you think about it, because Russell's a few points less than Piastri, but Hulkenberg's a few points more. So either or, I'd probably, just to be objective, go the Russell one too. Limitless lineup. I think you got to have triple McLaren in there. Take your pick, Max as well, and take your pick of the Mercedes and Ferraris guys, I think.
Agreed. Martin says Haas for Mercedes so I can have Piastri for Ocon. I don't like Piastri that much. I know Haas has been sneaky big at gaining some value, but as Rob mentioned earlier, these tier C assets are going to really struggle to gain at this circuit because of the fewer overtakes. So keep Merc in, keep Ocon in. I think you'll be okay. Could use that money to go from Ocon to an RB driver and be in pretty good shape too.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Thoughts on Lando, Piastri, Magnussen, Gasly, Hulkenberg, McLaren, RB? I think that looks good. Oh, hang on. Maybe that was answered before, unless that was the RB and Red Bull question, but I think we covered that one already. What do you think of Hamilton, Russell, Norris? Oh, Sauber's in there. I would probably downgrade Hamilton and or Russell to get a Mercedes driver, Mercedes constructor over Sauber. Not too reliable for my liking in the constructor department.
Agreed. Get Sauber out of there. Even though they fixed their pit stops, I don't like them that much.
Yeah, agreed. 116 million to use wildcard to go Norris, Russell, Jobot, Sargent, McLaren, Mercedes, or good C-tier drivers and Norris. I think if you're using wildcard, think about the long term, the next couple of weeks. And I wonder if at Spa, where there's a few more overtakes, whether the Norris and 4 good C-tiers is better. But
that's what I'd say. I think the lineups are close enough on balance, but then when you have to use a chip to get into the first lineup, that tilts the needle for me.
Okay. I'm going to quickly do the contest. If you want
go ahead.
If you want to fly through a couple more questions, I'll just quickly paste over the names. And
oh, Terry with a late breaker. The FIA have declared the track wet for qualifying. A quick note, things I learned at the British Grand Prix: if the track is wet, the 107% rule does not count. So if you're Logan Sargent posts a lap time that is a minute and a half slower than Verstappen, it is still fine. He does not get the penalty.
All right. Should we do this quickly and then we can cover off the last questions before
Hit it.
we wrap things up?
Ooh.
IKC 93, congratulations. I thought Harrison might have been on for what I think was going to be his third win. So unlucky Harrison.
I can picture Harrison's closet, just opens it up and it's just all fifth gear.
IKC, congratulations. We'll be in touch. Our fan app guys will be in touch with details on your prize.
Eduardo says no negative this week. It's going to be wet today, but hot tomorrow. I think we're just going to have to survive a craziness in the wet qualifying.
Definitely. Agreed. I think that could throw a few spanner in the works, though, for today.
Michael wants to know 2x on Russell or Ham. I'd say Russell at this point. Lewis seems like he's not happy this weekend.
No, he's not quite where he'd like to be.
And if you've got that money, I'd probably recommend Piastri, but you might have made your moves already and you're just trying to figure out the 2x.
Definitely. Where are we up to on the chat? Sorry, Adam.
I went to the bottom and now I'm scrolling up because my chat feed got timestamp jumbled.
Bogged down a little bit. Red Bull again. I'm going to start it.
Andrew's locked in with his team, going from Hamilton to Piastri, Gasly to Tsunoda. So this is coming from the P3 team in the Global League. Hamilton to Piastri, Gasly to Tsunoda.
Nice. I definitely like the Piastri move. That's going to be, I think, a good one for a lot of people. And FanAmp in the poll, Piastri favored considerably over Russell and Sainz. Does not surprise me at all. Okay.
Ooh, Albino asked a good question. RB over Haas. I assume we're talking about individual drivers because those two constructors, I would downgrade a driver to make better work of the constructors. Yep. RB over Haas, maybe this week because overtakes are a bit out the window. But again, very close.
Yeah, I'd probably go, if we're looking at drivers, for me personally, it's probably Hülkenberg, Ricciardo, Tsunoda, Magnussen in terms of order of preference. But constructors, I'd be looking at, as you say, Adam, downgrading other drivers in your team.
Fedgard wants to know the Sims want me to get Sargent because it enables better drivers. But isn't he like 80% sure to DNF? Don't worry, it's not going to be wet tomorrow. But what I did to get to my lineup, you can check the little X all the way to the right of Sargent and say, don't give me Sargent. And it could give you a team that makes you feel a little happier.
Okay, I've lost my timestamp, so I might just
shoot for anything we haven't answered at this point.
I think we answered Eduardo's question around the wild card. Keeping Magnussen, Gasly to roll an extra transfer, or use both to get Tsunoda, Ocon. I feel like it's pretty negligible. I'd maybe just roll the transfer, to be honest.
Yep, I'm a big fan of rolling a transfer. As wants to know, I have Lando, Gasly, Magnussen, Hülkenberg, Tsunoda, Merck, McLaren. What do I think?
I think it looks good.
Fine with that.
McLaren, Mercedes, Norris, Hülkenberg, Magnussen, Gasly, Ocon. Swap Gasly, Ocon for Ricciardo, Tsunoda. I don't mind that, honestly. If you're just, if you're sticking with like the Norris and good C tiers, I like the RBs.
Rob, Emily wants to know if you're trying to manifest a good weekend for Ferrari.
You know I am. You absolutely know I am. But I don't think that's going to happen regardless of how much Ferrari bet to have in the frame right now. Okay. Yeah, get those teams locked in. 2 minutes until the deadline. I think that's pretty much it. Any closing remarks, Adam? I think we covered most questions, or we did our best to.
These live sessions have been some of the funnest we've ever had, just week after week. So many new decisions. Now we're up to 4 constructors to pick from. I think it's going to be very interesting. Now, how does the rain impact qualifying? Could you have some mixed results with drivers that are unable to get up the grid in a low overtake circuit tomorrow? So it could throw a big monkey wrench into things, but we are locked in. Hopefully you're locked in too.
Can't wait. It's going to be a great weekend and hopefully a good result for us all by the end of the weekend.
Best of luck to all of you in your fantasy endeavors this weekend. Rob and I will be right back here in our preparations for Spa next week.